There we go, that's better. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to week 8 of our Birds of Newfoundland webinar series. I can't believe it's been 8 weeks, it's really exciting. And it's great to see that people are still coming out. It's great to see so many of you again tonight and so many of the same names. So I'm going to jump right in tonight. We usually wait for a few more people to show up, but there are many, many species tonight because as it turns out, other passerines is a pretty large category. I'm going to give you a warning right off the bat that we may go a little bit over an hour. Obviously, it's an online meeting, so it's really easy to leave whenever you need to leave, and we won't take offense. But with that said, I'm going to jump right into it. Most of you, I think, are familiar with our Birds Canada spiel by now. But just in case we have anybody new here, Birds Canada is Canada's voice for birds. So we are the leading science-based bird conservation organization in the country. And we aim to improve the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of Canada's wild birds and their habitats. And the way we do this is we establish partnerships with industry, with other NGOs, and with government, and we work to deliver a range of programs, almost all of which are citizen science-based. And what that means is that they are basically depending on people like you to go out and participate in the program and collect data and submit it. So we couldn't do these surveys without you, and I meant to update this number. Jenna, I think, had the updated number last week, and it was, I believe, 70,000 volunteers each year countrywide. So that's pretty amazing. Here in Newfoundland, as many of you have heard me say before, Birds Canada is a relatively new arrival. So we established an office here in 2019, and we run 2 programs here. And the first is the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas, which is a project where we're aiming to map all of the birds breeding on the island of Newfoundland. And I'm just going to leave it at that for today. And if you're interested in learning more about the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas, I really encourage you to come out to the presentation on April 4th, where we'll be talking about it in great detail. The other program that we have here and that I do want to talk a little bit more about today is the Atlantic Nocturnal Owl Survey. So this is actually the Nocturnal Owl Survey is a countrywide program. It's run in every province. And this is also a volunteer-based survey. It takes place between April 1st and May 15th each year. And it involves citizen scientists going out to a predetermined route with 10 stops and listening for owls at every stop along that route, just one evening between the 1st of April and May 15th. And so we're really looking for volunteers for that at the moment. We're looking for volunteers to take on some of our existing routes, which need adopting. But I also have this little map, which shows the location of all of the owl routes in Newfoundland. It's cut off Labrador, unfortunately, at the moment. But you can see that we have some coverage problems. So we're really looking to establish some new routes as well. And in particular, if there's anybody here tonight from the Northern Peninsula, or anywhere in central, southern Newfoundland. This is obviously a huge hole in our coverage and we would really, really like to fill it. So if you're interested in doing an owl survey, send me an email and we'll see if we can set up a route. All right, and of course, each week we do have to acknowledge all of the partners and sponsors that help us make the Atlas possible. So it's a huge project. We wouldn't be able to do it and we wouldn't be able to offer a free webinar series like this without the support of all of our funders and partners. All right, so pausing to take breath now. Today we are covering other passerines, which is really just a bit of a grab bag. It's all of the birds that didn't really fit into any category that would have in sufficient numbers that we could have done a webinar just about them. But I just wanted to take a minute to talk about the word passerine, because it's one that we've used quite a bit during these presentations. And some of you may know what it means, some of you may not. So basically, it's birds belonging to the order Passeriformes. We tend to think of them as songbirds. Not all of them are songbirds, but actually this order includes more than half the world's bird species. So it's a very large order, and essentially it means small perching birds. So shared characteristics, they tend to be small to medium body size. They do tend to be relatively vocal. All the songbirds are passerines. They have altricial chicks. What that means is that the chicks, when they hatch, are naked essentially and helpless, and they need to be fed by the parents. And you can compare that with something like the shorebirds, which their chicks pop right out of the nest as soon as, so they're precocial chicks. As soon as they hatch, they're pretty much an hour later, they're running all around. Passerines tend to have bright plumage as well. They tend to be diurnal. There are exceptions to that. And then I've put feet there. So really the thing that joins all passerines together is their feet. They have unwebbed toes. They have 4 toes, and the toes have little talons at the end. And then as you can see in this silhouette, and then I'll move on to the next slide where you can see the little feet on this warbler. Does anybody want to guess what kind of warbler it is based on a couple weeks ago? You can put it in the chat if you want to guess. So you've got this arrangement of toes, which is called anisodactyl. 3 toes face forward and 1 faces backwards. And this allows the birds to easily cling to horizontal and vertical perches, basically, so branches and tree trunks. And what's really cool about them is for humans, for example, we actually have to activate our muscles to clench our fingers or our toes. But for passerines, the relaxed position of the feet is clenched, so that allows them to perch easily even when they're sleeping. And so it's this toe arrangement and the gripping that makes all passerines perching birds. That's why we call them perching birds. So fun facts about passerines. What are we going to cover today? Like I said, there's a lot of species. I've sort of grouped them together. When I made the first list for tonight's presentation, there were 35 species. Just for comparison, most weeks we've been covering sort of 20 to 25. So to try and make the information more manageable, I've actually taken all of the species that are listed as species at risk, so things that are endangered or threatened or of special concern. They're all removed from tonight's presentation because we actually have a separate webinar in a couple weeks where we're going to be talking about species at risk. So, and yes, I see that everyone in the chat had yellow-rumped warbler, and you are indeed correct. That was a yellow-rumped warbler. So way to go, guys. I'm impressed. Okay, so we're going to jump right in with the swallows. So there are really 3 species of swallows that breed in Newfoundland, but the 2 that you can see in gray here, barn swallow and bank swallow, those are listed species. They are at risk, and so we're not going to talk about them tonight, which leaves us with just the tree swallow. And this is a bird that many of you are going to be familiar with. So they're relatively common breeders in Newfoundland, and you'll often see them chasing aerial insects over open fields or near marshes or water. They do really like shallow water. I have to say I have a special fondness for tree swallows because they are the first species that I studied when I started working in bird research. And there's not too much else that looks like a tree swallow. So you've got a small songbird with a long body, small round head, and then all the swallows have these tiny but kind of wide bills. Tree swallows are an iridescent blue on the back and the head. They've got long wings, but a short tail. They've got short little legs, and this is, so when birders or when ornithologists study birds, a lot of the time they catch them and they put bands on them, and we'll often put color bands to distinguish individuals. So most little passerines, you can put 2 bands per leg, so you can put a metal band with a number and then 3 colors to distinguish individuals. But tree swallow legs are actually too short to do this, so you can only put 1 band on each leg, so there's no way to color band them to distinguish individuals. Tree swallows also have a white throat and breast, and they have a black mask around the eye. So it's not super obvious because they're already such a dark blue color, but there is a black mask there. Young females, so those that are breeding for the first time, they may be a little bit duller, so they may be sort of brownish above with only hints of blue. But once they fully mature, females tend to be just as blue-green as males. The other thing is in flight, you'll actually notice tiny crescents of white on either side of the rump. So basically the underside comes up a little bit, and I don't have a picture of that. And I just wanted to take a minute to talk about where tree swallows nest. So they're named tree swallows because they nest in tree cavities. They're what we call secondary cavity nesters, which means they don't excavate their own cavities, but they use cavities that things like woodpeckers have already excavated. But they also are famous for readily nesting in artificial nest boxes, so like this one. And this has actually made them a model species for many, many scientific studies. You can establish whole grids of tree swallow boxes and keep track of colonies. And you can really keep track of what's going on in the nest during the year. So because I started by studying tree swallows, I got really frustrated when I studied other birds and realized that you don't always have the opportunity to just open their front door, peer into the nest and see what's going on there. Okay, so moving on from our swallows, we're now moving on to the Tyrant Flycatchers. And again, we have 5 species here, but olive-sided flycatchers are listed as a species of risk, so, species at risk, so we'll be covering them in a couple weeks. So we're going to talk about the yellow-bellied flycatcher, alder flycatcher, least flycatcher, and eastern kingbird. This is probably our most common flycatcher, the yellow-bellied flycatcher, and you will hear these guys throughout the boreal forest during the summer. They like evergreen forest, they like peatlands, but you do need to make sure that you're getting out there to look for them in June and July. They don't stick around on the breeding grounds for long. So they have one of the shortest stays of any neotropical migrant, often less than 70 days. So that's they get in here, they breed, and they leave again. ID cues for these guys. So the yellow wash across the belly is really important. They do have 2 wing bars. They have an olive back, and there's a white eye-ring here, which isn't super distinct, but it is there. And then they have a slightly peaked head. And I do have here an example of the yellow-bellied flycatcher song and call, which I will play. So they make that little chibek, chibek. And then a weep call. So you will often hear these guys. They're very, very common. It's good. It's a good song and call to start with to be able to recognize. Okay. And I included this picture. It's terrible, terrible picture. It's when I took this last field season, because this is an example of a yellow-bellied flycatcher nest. And you really, really have to look for it. So the nest is in there. It was quite high up. This is with pretty mega zoom on my camera, and you can just see the little eye of the bird inside the nest. So I saw just the back end of a bird disappearing into this clump here of branches, and I ended up sitting there for 45 minutes waiting for somebody to come out of the nest to figure out what species the nest belonged to. But if you come across one of those, that is what a flycatcher, yellow-bellied flycatcher nest looks like. Our next species is the alder flycatcher. They are some tyrant flycatchers in general, I really struggle with in terms of ID. They're some of the hardest birds to identify, and alder flycatchers in particular are actually visually identical to willow flycatchers, but luckily we don't have willow flycatchers here. So we have it a lot easier than the people in, say, Ontario. These guys are found in wet, brushy habitats. And they're also greenish olive above. They also have 2 wing bars. They have a gray band across the chest and a white throat, so you don't see the yellow wash that you saw in the yellow-bellied. And they have an eye ring, but it's narrower. And their song is a buzzy free beer. So at least that's what I hear, and that's what a lot of people hear when they hear the alder flycatcher sing. So you can hear the little free beer there. Okay, and last flycatcher that we're going to cover today, oh, sorry, not second last flycatcher. This is the least flycatcher. And as I said, you're looking at birds that are somewhat challenging to identify. So we've got another grayish olive flycatcher with 2 wing bars, but these guys are somewhat easier to identify because they're quite small. They have a much bolder eye ring, and they also have a distinctive song. So when you're dealing with flycatchers, often the song is the way to go. So they have a chibek song that sets them apart. They like deciduous and mixed forests. And on the breeding ground, what I find interesting is these guys can nest in clusters. So they can form a flycatcher neighborhood with 2 to 30 territories all in the same area. but they are relatively uncommon breeders in Newfoundland. So they're actually only found in the southwestern corner of the island. And that is the case for a number of the species that we're going to be talking about tonight. So I'll be mentioning a lot. This bird is only found in the southwestern corner of the island. So ID cues for the least flycatcher. Again, you've got this grayish olive above, you've got the 2 white wing bars, a dusky breast, but not that same gray band across it, quite a small bill, and a bold eye ring, but relatively narrow. Okay. And there's our chibek, quite quick. And they sing pretty incessantly, so they just keep going. All right, and our last flycatcher tonight is the Eastern Kingbird. And this guy luckily looks quite different from the other 3. It's an uncommon breeder in Newfoundland, again, but we did just last year have a likely breeding record for it here on the Avalon Peninsula, so it is possible that you will come across them breeding. Eastern Kingbirds are dark above and then white below, and the really easy ID cue for these guys is they've got this nice square tail with a white tip right across the bottom. So that's the thing that I have noticed most often about Eastern Kingbirds. You see this nice white line across the bottom of the tail. They tend to have a very upright posture. So as you can see here, they're kind of standing upright. That's true of many flycatchers as well. Okay, so we're through our flycatchers. I'll try and slow down a little bit. I'm worried that we're going to end up way over time, so I've been rushing through, but all right, let's talk vireos here. So here we have 3 species, the blue-headed vireo, the Philadelphia vireo, and the red-eyed vireo, of which the most common is the blue-headed vireo. But it's still classified as relatively uncommon if you look at Nature NL's bird list. You'll reasonably often come across these guys foraging. They tend to be pretty high. They like the canopy, and they have a very cheerful song that's sort of "see you, cheerio." So these guys are most often found in mature deciduous forest in eastern North America, but something I do think is interesting is in western North America, they actually like coniferous forest, which we have plenty of here. Both sexes help to build the nest, and like all vireo nests, it's a hanging basket nest, suspended from a horizontal fork in the outer branches of small trees or shrubs. So even though they forage up really high, the nest is usually built pretty low. So this actually is one that you may encounter when you're out birding. These guys are pretty distinct for vireos, and the biggest cue for me, so there's the blue-gray head, which is, the name tells you that you're looking for a blue head, but you've got these white spectacles. So there's an eye ring, and then the lores are also white. So it looks like they're wearing a little pair of white glasses. You've got wing barbs and an olive green back again. A white breast and belly, and then you've got this yellowish color on the flanks, which you can't see terribly well on this guy because he has his wing in the way. Some individuals may be more gray on the back and not olive green. So I'm going to play this song. This is the only vireo song that I'm going to play today. There are distinct differences between vireo songs, but they all sort of have the same, they have a characteristic tone. So I'm playing this one because this is the species you're most likely to come across, but just generally having a good idea of what a vireo song sounds like can be really helpful. So you can hear it's relatively cheerful. Blue-headed vireos are a little bit slower than some of the other vireo songs, but the thing I always hear is "Here I Am, Way Up Here," which is the mnemonic we use for red-eyed vireo song in Ontario. But it's also very true of these birds because they are often up in the canopy. The second species of vireo to cover is a Philadelphia vireo. These guys are uncommon in Newfoundland, and again, they're usually in the southwestern part of the island. Like all vireos, and you can see it somewhat, you can see it a little bit on the blue-headed vireo here. So they've got this thick bill with a little hook at the end. That's the characteristic vireo bill. And so this is also true of Philadelphia vireos. Philadelphia vireos, I realize this isn't a great photo. It's the only one I could actually come across. And I think the reason is a lot of people don't take pictures of Philadelphia vireos because they're pretty plain and unmarked. They're also very up high in the canopy, which could make things difficult. But you're looking at a relatively plain bird with a dark gray head, a grayish brown back. They do have a white or a lighter eyebrow here and a yellow throat and a yellow breast and belly. But in fresh plumage, that can be quite bright, but it obviously becomes much more worn as the plumage gets older. And there's also a lot of variation among individuals in how bright they can be. And just to make life even more complicated, this white eyebrow here, this light eyebrow, can be indistinct on some individuals. Something to keep an eye out for here, though, is it does have unmarked wings. And that's unlike the blue-headed vireo, which has those wing bars. And then the third species of vireo that we have here is the red-eyed vireo. And again, this is an uncommon breeder in Newfoundland, although they're quite common in Ontario, which is where I grew up. And when I was learning to band birds, we actually caught a lot of these guys. And so the first thing I knew about them is that they scream when you catch them loudly and frequently. This is a great photo because you can really see the little hooked bill on this guy. So when you're looking at red-eyed vireos, they're larger and more aggressive than the other two. And it's got much more distinct face markings. So you've got a gray crown, and then you've got this white eyebrow, and on either side of the eyebrow, you've got two dark stripes. You've got a plain white breast and belly. So even when a Philadelphia vireo is faded, it's not going to be quite as clean looking as the red-eyed vireo. You've got an olive green back. Again, you've got unmarked wings, and relatively speaking, you've got quite a large bill on red-eyed vireos. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, it's called the red-eyed vireo, and an obvious field marking here is that red eye. And it's true in this picture, you can see it very well. However, it's not always easy to see the red eye on a red-eyed vireo, and at least not in the field when it's quite high up in the canopy and the light conditions might not be ideal. And two other vireo species also have red eyes, although to be fair, neither of them are found in Newfoundland. And I wanted to take a minute here to compare the Philadelphia vireo and the red-eyed vireo, because both of them you're looking at sort of olive gray backs, you're looking at unmarked wings. Philadelphia vireos, though, are quite a bit smaller, and relative to their head, they have a shorter bill. Red-eyed vireos, again, you've got a much more distinct facial pattern. Even though they share that light eyebrow, it's much more obvious on the red-eyed vireo. And then, as I said, you've got this clean white breast and belly, which even when you don't have a lot of yellow on the Philadelphia vireo, it's still going to be much cleaner and brighter. Okay, so that's it for the vireos. And now we're into the corvids. So these are birds from the family Corvidae, jays, magpies, and crows. And these are the birds that everybody's quite familiar with. So we're not going to take a lot of time on this section, but I'll just mention that corvids are found worldwide. And I think the thing that everybody thinks of when they think about crows and their allies is that they're known for their intelligence. So for example, some corvids can recognize themselves in mirrors, which we have long thought to be a human characteristic. And some of them, like American crows, can actually make and use tools, which is very cool. And this intelligence may be why they have adapted so well to us and are often common in areas with a lot of human traffic. So our first corvid is the blue jay, which I'm sure everybody is very familiar with. They will come to feeders a lot. They'll often eat seeds by grasping them in their feet and then cracking them with their bills. They're known to take and eat eggs and nestlings of other birds, but we don't actually know how common this is. So one person found that only 1% of jays in a population had evidence of eggs or nestlings from other birds in their stomachs, and mostly they ate insects and nuts. But definitely keep in mind that they can be predators of other birds. And it's funny, when I went to put the field marks on this guy, it occurred to me that I've never really thought about the field marks for a blue jay before. Blue jays are just blue jays. So most of you will recognize blue jays. Something to pay attention to is this sort of black necklace here, and the fact that they have a little crest. They've got black barring on their wings and tail, and in flight, they actually have white corners on their tail, which can be quite distinctive. Okay, so moving on from blue jays, we have another jay species here, the Canada jay, which is also probably familiar to many of you. It's not found in cities like blue jays are, but it is a common denizen of campsites, and it is often referred to as the campsite robber because it tends to steal food from your campsite. So watch out for these guys. They look cute, but they're definitely out to steal your Cheerios. This species was formerly known as the gray jay, but its name was officially changed in 2018 to the Canada jay, partly because it's present in every single Canadian province and territory. It's also often known as the whiskey jack, which is taken from several Indigenous words, which mean spirit that likes to play tricks on people. And these guys are fascinating. They look cute and fluffy. Oops, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Quite a bit ahead of myself. There we go. But they actually spend their winter in northern forests, so they're resident, they don't migrate, and they breed much earlier than many other species that live here. So even the residents, these guys will actually start breeding in the winter, and they'll incubate eggs in temperatures that can actually drop below -25°C. So they start breeding really early, they raise nestlings in very cold weather, and weirdly, they don't actually attempt to nest again. So even though they've got this really early start on the breeding season and probably more time to try again, they don't. They just have that one brood. So by the time we're out looking for birds for the Breeding Bird Atlas in the summer, really what we're looking for is fledgling Canada jays as opposed to nests. So field marks on a Canada jay, you've got white cheeks, throat, and forehead. They're dark gray above, they're lighter gray below, and they've got this nice long tail. Relative to other corvids, they've got kind of a small, short bill, which I think helps them be cute and fluffy looking, especially in the winter when they do fluff up their feathers for warmth. And just kind of an interesting little tidbit about Canada jays. So first of all, they're one of those species of birds where the fledglings look quite different than the adults. So this is a fledgling Canada jay. They're kind of all dark gray as opposed to having the pattern of the adults. And Canada jays are known for storing food for later use. So that's probably how they manage to survive during the cold boreal winters. They will use their saliva, which is sticky, to glue all kinds of food, whether it's insects or roadkill or berries and seeds. They'll glue it to upper tree branches above the snow line. And what that means is that they're actually at substantial risk from climate change. So this is coming from a study of Canada jays in Algonquin Park. And what the researchers out of the University of Guelph found is that climate change is leading to an increase in freeze and thaw cycles. And because of that, the food isn't staying frozen all winter and it's actually spoiling. So the birds don't have as much high quality food, and because they breed so early, they really need that food to support their nestlings. So because they've got less food that they can depend on, we're actually seeing decreased reproductive success. And this population in Algonquin Park in Ontario, which has been followed for 40 years, has declined substantially from a high of 85 to 40 to 50 individuals a year. And it's something that we need to think about as well here in Newfoundland. So there are predictions that Canada jays may not, their range is going to shift quite substantially, and we may not be seeing them as often here. Okay, crows, another corvid, another one that we're all familiar with, very often seen in cities. They usually feed on the ground and they eat almost anything. So earthworms, insects, small animals. They build large stick nests. And something to note about crows is we often see them carrying food. And for most bird species, when we see them carrying food, we assume that they are carrying that for their nestlings. But this is not necessarily the case with crows. So just because they're carrying food, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're breeding. Carrying food, they'll carry food for themselves long distances before eating it. As I said, these guys will often make and use tools, which is pretty cool. So these are really, really smart birds. This was a hard one to put field markings on. So it's an all black bird with a slight gloss to its plumage. It has a large, thick bill and a short tail. The darkness and the glossiness of the plumage kind of depend on lighting conditions, though. And something to keep in mind when you're looking at flying crows is they fly with a rowing motion, so like a methodical rowing flapping, and they don't glide very often. And that can contrast with the common raven. So this is also something that we see a lot here in Newfoundland, and they look quite a bit like crows, and these guys are also well known for their phenomenal intelligence. So if we put field markings on this guy, we see that it's got a very large, hefty bill. It's got a long tail, but again, you're looking at an all black bird. Do note this shaggy throat here, which is unique to ravens. And these guys fly with heavy, slow wing beats, and they do sometimes glide. So that kind of distinguishes them from crows. And I have to say, I really struggle with the raven versus crow identification. And I'm glad to know that it is not just me, because I actually have seen some expert birders get this wrong during the eBird photo quizzes that Nature NL does. So it can be a really, really tricky distinction to make. So the obvious answer is that crows are smaller than ravens. But as we have pointed out many times before, size is a relative thing. And so that can really only be helpful if you have a crow sitting beside a raven. And then on top of that, we actually seem to have some very large crows here. And I have that on authority from one of our expert birders as well. So we have some pretty large crows. So what can you use to tell the difference between a raven and a crow? First of all, ravens, both of them have large bills, but raven bills are really kind of honking bills. So these are large, hefty bills. And then they've got those shaggy throat feathers that the crows don't have. Now this crow is puffed up, but you still don't see the same shaggy throat that you see on the raven. And the most useful cue I find is when they're flying. So that's what I find the easiest way to distinguish them. You can look at the shape of their tail. So raven tails are diamond shaped or wedge shaped. You can see a longer tail with it coming almost to a point there, whereas the crow tail is shorter and it's sort of rounded or squared. So you don't see it coming to that point. And that's what I find the easiest way to distinguish between ravens and crows, if they're helpful and they fly and they let you see the shape of their tail. Okay, moving on from the corvids to chickadees, nuthatches, and creepers. And again, these are going to be species that many of you are familiar with. So first is the black-capped chickadee, common in urban areas as well as mixed forests. A very small but extremely hardy passerine that spends its winter at northern latitudes as well. So it's resident, it does not migrate. They're very feisty little birds, as you'll know, if you've ever encountered one. And if you've ever been a bander and had one in your hand, you'll know that they are extremely feisty and do like to bite right at the edge of your nails. So they're very good at causing pain with a very small bill. Something neat about chickadees, if you've watched them at your feeder, because they're common feeder birds, you'll notice that you may have noticed that they have a dominance hierarchy. So certain birds are always dominant over other individuals. And if they want the feeder, everybody else has to clear out. So these guys have a really complex social system. So field markings. This is a small bird, large round head, small thin bill. You've got the black cap that it's named for, white cheeks, a black bib, gray back and wings, and then buffy colored underparts. And I've got two sounds to play here. So many of you are likely familiar with the chickadee sound that the bird makes. Let's see if we can play that one. So that's the chickadee call. But what you may not be aware of is that's not the bird's song, it's the alarm call. So the bird's song is actually a simple, pure, either 2 or 3 note whistled Phoebe or cheeseburger is the other mnemonic that people have used for it. So that's the chickadee song. But I think that the familiar calls are particularly interesting because they contain all kinds of information. So that chickadee call is in response to a threat, and the birds will actually modify the number of Ds that they have in that call based on the level of threat. So if something is a pretty low level threat, they'll just say chickadee. But something that's a much higher level threat, like for example, a sharp shintok that can chase them through the forest understory, that will get many more Ds. And then what I find even cooler is that chickadees will often spend the winter in mixed species flocks. And most other species do pay attention to chickadee alarm calls. So a lot of species will come and investigate what the alarm call is. And it turns out that those other species will actually modify their responses based on the number of Ds in the chickadee alarm call. So in other words, many species of birds actually do speak and understand chickadee, which I think is really, really neat. And we don't need to hear, all right. We'll move on to our next species. We don't need to hear the alarm calls again. So this is a Boreal Chickadee. This is very cool to me because they're common in Newfoundland, but not in Southern Ontario. So they were new to me when I moved here. They like coniferous and mixed forests, but they particularly like those dominated by spruce or by balsam fir. And like other chickadee species, including black-capped chickadees, these guys will cache food. So they cache seeds and insects during the summer and the fall to get them through the boreal winter, much like the Canada jays. So the ID cues on a Boreal Chickadee, you've got white cheeks, but note that they're much smaller than the white cheek patch on the black-capped chickadee. And instead of a black cap, you've got a brown cap with a gray collar and these nice cinnamon colored flanks. And then you still have the black throat patch. These guys also make a chickadee call, but it's slower and buzzier and sort of more nasal than the black-capped chickadees. So I've often heard people say it sounds a little bit like a black-capped chickadee that's been smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. And I did include this one as well. So you can hear a lot more nasal. And that's, you often hear them before you see them. These guys are always on the move. So that's a really good way to distinguish between the two chickadee species. Then we have one species of nuthatch here, the red-breasted nuthatch. So these are frequent visitors at feeders as well, so you're probably familiar with them. And they can be seen moving up and down and around tree trunks and branches. They're often seen creeping headfirst down tree trunks. So if you see an upside down bird, think nuthatch a lot of the time. They also like spruce and fir forests, and like both species of chickadees, they're cavity nesters. So they build their nests inside cavities in trees. But unlike the tree swallows, which I mentioned were secondary cavity nesters, both species of chickadee and the nuthatch are usually primary cavity nesters. So they actually excavate their own nesting holes. So the identifiers for the red-breasted nuthatch, you've got blue-gray above and then a rusty kind of orangey red color below. They have a black crown with a white eyebrow and a black eyeline, so a really strongly marked face. They kind of have no neck at all, so a little bit, think football player with the shoulder pads way up there. Females look very similar to males, but they're a little bit paler. So instead of a black crown, they may have a gray crown and sort of a lighter rusty colored underpart. And I've also included their calls here because you'll often hear them in the forest, and it's really satisfying to be able to know what they are. So the description I've heard for these is it's yank yank is the mnemonic for it, and they sound a little bit like tiny horns in the treetops. So this is what red-breasted nuthatches sound like. A little bit like horns honking. Okay, and the last species in this grouping is the brown creeper, which is a very, very cool bird. It's named for its unique feeding habits. So they're a little bit like woodpeckers in that they have these nice stiff tails, and they use those to prop themselves up on tree trunks while they probe the bark for insects and spiders. But unlike woodpeckers, they actually start exploring for these insects right at the bottom of the tree, and then they ascend in a spiral around the tree trunk until they get to the top. And then they fly to a new tree, start at the bottom again. So it's a neat feeding habit to watch. They really like old growth closed canopy forest during the breeding season. They're a little bit less picky during the winter. And in fact, there's a brown creeper that can often be found in Bowring Park here in St. John's during the winter and spring, I believe. So what you're looking for with a brown creeper is it's a very small songbird, and it looks much more delicate than the nuthatch. So the nuthatch, like I said, is a little bit like the football player with no neck. These guys are much sort of finer and more delicate. They do like similar habitat to the nuthatch. They've got these white underparts and then this mottled brown back. So they're cryptically colored, and that helps them blend in. They've got that long stiff tail, which they use to prop themselves up on the tree trunk. And then a thin decurved bill. So it curves downward, which you can maybe see in that picture there. So these are really, really neat birds. Okay, and moving on to our next group, the kinglets. We have two species of kinglet here, which we're going to cover. So we'll start with the ruby-crowned kinglet. So both of the kinglets are really tiny songbirds. They're smaller than warblers, they're smaller than chickadees, and they are always on the move. So they're really hard to track down, and I'm super impressed that Tina managed to get this amazing photo because I spent most of the summer trying to get a kinglet photo and ended up with a lot of photos of empty branches or blurry tails right at the edge of the frame. So they forage with ruby-crowned kinglets forage with twitchy motions and a lot of wing flicking. They like to flick their wings. And these guys, they sing a lot, and their song starts quite quietly, but it builds to a fairly loud volume. So I always forget in the spring exactly how loud these guys can get, and I'm often looking for a much bigger bird singing their song. Something else that's really neat about ruby-crowned kinglets, they're tiny, and yet the females will lay 12 eggs in a clutch, which for a songbird is a phenomenal number of eggs. So most songbirds will lay clutches of sort of 5, maybe 6 eggs, and ruby-crowned kinglets will have twice as many. They're olive green above. They've got yellow-edged wing and tail feathers. They've got a white wing bar, which you can see there. And they've got a white eye ring, which you can't see terribly well in this picture, but that's their only facial marking, that white eye ring. You'll note on this wing bar here, you've also got a bar of black below. So you've got a nice clean white wing bar, and then you've got this line of black and the feathers underneath. And again, some of you may be wondering why I haven't pointed out the brilliant ruby crown here. It is flashed by adult males when they are excited, but otherwise it's almost completely concealed. So you actually very rarely see the ruby crown on a ruby crowned kinglet. So it's not the best identification mark to rely on. Our second species of kinglet is a golden crowned kinglet. However, they're quite similar to ruby crowned kinglets in a lot of ways. But whereas ruby crowned kinglets migrate, golden crowned kinglets are actually resident year-round in Newfoundland, and they're very good at withstanding cold winter temperatures up to minus 40 degrees Celsius in a lot of cases, which is pretty amazing when you think that this is a songbird that's smaller than a chickadee and smaller than a warbler. They like black spruce and balsam fir dominated forests. And even though they've got a very short breeding season, because we do have a pretty short season here in the boreal forest, these little guys will often raise 2 broods of young. So they'll have their first nest, and then the female will feed the fledglings from that nest for only a day after they leave the nest. And then she'll start laying her second nest of eggs right away, and the male will take care of the fledglings. So you're looking at similar size and similar movement patterns to the ruby-crowned kinglet. And there are some similarities in terms of field markings. So again, you've got these yellow-edged wing and tail feathers, and you've got a white wing bar. But these guys have much more boldly patterned faces. So you've got the yellow crown, which you can see even when the bird is not excited. When they are excited, they do raise it, and you can see a much more orangey color, but you will see a yellow crown on all of the birds. And then it's bordered by these black stripes, and then you've got a white line over the eye. So much more boldly patterned than the ruby-crowned kinglet, which just has that eye ring. Okay, I think we're going to make it through this. We may not make it through the quiz, but I think we'll make it through our species by 8:30. So we're moving on to our thrushes, and there are 5 species here. But the gray-cheeked thrush, again, is listed as a species at risk, or will be shortly, depending on who you ask. And so we're not going to cover it today. So we're going to talk about Varios, Swainson's thrushes, hermit thrushes, and American robins. Okay, so we're going to start with the veery, not an incredibly common bird breeder in Newfoundland. So it's another one of those birds that you really only find breeding in the southwestern part of the province. And I believe I remember Megan saying, Megan Boucher, who contributed some Codroy Valley breeding locations to us a few weeks ago, there is reliably a veery on the Starlight Trail in the Codroy Valley. These guys like damp mixed forests, particularly with the shrubby understory. And they're uniformly cinnamon brown above, which is a darker red color than other thrushes. And there's really no contrast between the back and the tail. So they're very uniform on the back. They have indistinct spotting on the throat and breast, and then pale underparts, and basically unmarked faces, essentially, which does contrast with our other thrush species. So the Swainson's thrush, you can see some similarities, but you see much more patterning on the face in the Swainson's thrush. So these guys breed primarily in spruce, fir, and mixed forests. And these guys are interesting. Most thrushes will forage in the understory or in the leaf litter. Swainson's thrush will actually chase flying insects, which is unusual for a thrush. They are more often seen than heard. So they have a beautiful flute-like song, which spirals upward. They're the only thrush with a song that spirals upward. The problem is, even though you can often hear it, it can be quite difficult to track. So it's almost like they project their voice, either because they're moving quickly from one perch to another, or because the sound reverberates in dense forests. And they sometimes will also sing more quietly so that it seems like the song is coming from farther away. So again, you can often hear them, and they can be quite challenging to find. I haven't included the song here because I was worried about time, and my favorite song is the Hermit Thrush song, so I have included that one. Markings for Swainson's thrush, you've got olive brown above and pale underparts, but you've got much more dark spotting on the throat and breast than you had on the veery. And instead of just plain white underparts, you've also got this buffy wash that extends down the throat and into the breast a little bit. And then, as I said, you do have facial markings. So you've got a buffy eye ring and then buffy lores, which give it almost a spectacled appearance, a little bit like our blue-headed vireos. So you've got like a little bit of buffy spectacles there. And then our third thrush that we're talking about today is the hermit thrush. So these guys are found, again, in the understory of the forest, but they like edges and openings. They forage on the ground and they nest on the ground, and they tend to hop around while they forage in the leaf litter. So you may notice that. They have a very erect posture. So they've got their head raised and their bill raised a little bit, and they will often flick their wings and then raise their tail as well. So you can look for the posture. This guy is the only thrush of its genus, which is the Catharis genus, that remains in North America for the winter. Now, they don't stay in Newfoundland for the winter, but they don't go as far south as other thrushes. And it's been suggested that might be because they will add fruit to their diet in the winter, and that may enable them to stay further north, because if they were depending on insects, they would have to go pretty far south. So for hermit thrushes, you see a thin white eye ring, but you don't see those buffy lores, so no spectacles. They're brown above, and then the best cue you can use is the difference between the sort of reddish tail and rump and the brown back. So there is a contrast between the back and the rump. They've got spots on the throat and smudge spots on the breast, and then pale underparts as well. And then they do have spots on the flank, which are even more smudged. So they get sort of progressively more smudged as they move down from the throat. And as I said, I had to include this song because it's my complete favorite bird song. It's fluty and ethereal. It's a little bit like the Swainson's thrush song, but it doesn't spiral up. And hermit thrush songs start with a single note, like a pure note, which is unlike the Swainson's thrush. So some of you actually may have noticed that song on one of the earlier recordings. I think one of the Chickadee recordings had the Hermit Thrush in the background. And our final thrush for the day, the American robin. Again, clearly a bird that most of us are familiar with. We often consider them a harbinger of spring. So we're on the lookout for them at this time of year. However, in a lot of places, including portions of Newfoundland, they actually stay year round. So they aren't, in fact, a harbinger of spring. It's just they're not as visible during the winter. So robins are at home almost anywhere, woodlands, rural areas, urban yards. And they're named, as many of you may know, after European robins because they share sort of that red breast, but they're not at all closely related to that species. So the ID cues you're looking for on an American robin, you've got this rusty orange breast and belly, a dark head, a yellow bill, and you can't really see it on this guy because his head is bent, but dark streaks on the throat. So females and immatures may be paler than males. They may have more white on the belly and on the throat, but it's not easy to distinguish sex and age categories in American robins. Okay, our second to last big group, the blackbirds. We have 4 species here. 2 of them are species at risk. So the bobolink and the rusty blackbird we'll cover in a few weeks. Today we're going to talk about the redwing blackbird and the common grackle. The redwing blackbird is one of the most common birds in North America. It's very, very common in Ontario. It's not actually that common in Newfoundland, except again in that southwestern part of the island. And for me, that was one of the strange things about moving here to Newfoundland, because I'm so used to redwing blackbirds that I don't think of them as exciting at all, but here they actually are an exciting sighting. So it's kind of one of the interesting things about traveling to bird, because things that are not exciting at home may become exciting in the new place, and vice versa. People here don't get super excited about boreal chickadees necessarily, and I was really thrilled by them. Redwing blackbirds inhabit marshes, swamps, and that kind of area, and they're very territorial. So you will see a lot of fights between males as they compete to claim and defend territories. And when they're displaying, they'll sit on cattails or reeds on an elevated perch like this, and they will extend their wings and puff up their shoulder patches and sing. So the male redwing blackbird, you've got this, again, all blackbird, very red shoulder patch with a yellow border. So these are called epaulets. And a slender conical bill. These guys are pretty hard to mistake. The females are a little bit more difficult to identify. So again, they do have that conical bill, but other than that, they've got this streaky brown plumage and a yellow wash around the bill. So they're much less conspicuous. And interestingly, redwing blackbirds are highly polygynous. So that means that one male can have multiple females on his territory. I think the record is about 15. So one male can defend a territory with 15 females. And then our second blackbird that we're going to talk about today is the common grackle. This is another bird that's primarily found in the southwest corner of the island, although there's also a population on the Avalon Peninsula, and they can be reliably seen in St. John's near Virginia Lake. And their breeding range is actually expanding to cover the entire island. They eat pretty much anything. So they do come to feeders, which is what this guy in the picture is doing, but they also love crops. They really like corn. And both male and female grackles sing, and their song sounds a little bit like the squeak of a rusty gate. And when they're singing, the males will puff up their body feathers and spread their tails. So they'll really display while they sing. So for grackles, the big ID cue is going to be this long, broad tail. They look a little bit like a blackbird that's been stretched out. So they've got long legs, they've got a long, broad tail, and they've got a long bill for a blackbird. So it's like somebody's grabbed either end of them and pulled. They've got an iridescent blue head and then a bronze body, although again, what you see will depend a lot on the lighting. So they may just appear all dark, but if you catch them in the right light, you'll see that iridescence. They've got a bright yellow eye, and they've got these long, strong legs. And females are very similar looking, but then a little bit less glossy. Okay, and I lumped everything into this last slide. So we've got everything else here, and we're going to cover 5 species that we see here, and these are our last 5 species. So we're starting with the winter wren. It's the only wren species we have here in Newfoundland, so it's relatively easy to identify just by its distinctive wren posture. So that's with this tail stuck straight up in the air like that. It's very tiny. Wrens are quite small, and it has a very loud song, but it's, again, one of those birds that is often heard rather than seen. It's not particularly common in Newfoundland, but its range does encompass the entire island. So it's not one of those species we only find in the southwestern corner. They do like old growth forest, which can restrict their range somewhat. And what you're looking for with the winter wren, you've got brown overall with a pale eyebrow, and then barring on the tail, on the wings, and on the belly. As I said, the posture will probably give the winter wren away because we don't have other species of wren here. And these guys will often bob their entire body, almost as if doing squats, while they look around the understory of the forage, or of the forest where they forage. In terms of mockingbirds and thrashers, we sometimes have gray catbirds here. This is very uncommon in Newfoundland, and if you look at the current range map, it doesn't actually include Newfoundland, but we do see a few every year, and last year we saw a lot of them actually. Like mockingbirds, these guys are mimics, so they will imitate the songs of many other species, and they'll sing all day. So many bird species, their song peaks in the morning and you get another little burst at night, but these guys will just keep going all day. Their name, however, comes from the call. They make a mewing call that does actually sound a lot like a cat. So if you've heard it once, you will remember it. They're a medium-sized bird. They look a little bit like a thrush, and they perch often with their tail straight down like this, which gives them kind of this weird hunchback look. They're gray overall. They have a very long tail, and then they've got a little dark cap there. And what you can't see on this photo is their undertail coverts. So right underneath the tail here at the rump area are cinnamon colored. So they're quite noticeable. American pipits. So this falls under the pipit and wagtail category. These guys are slender and delicate and relatively nondescript, to be honest. So they really like remote areas. People don't see them a lot of the time. They're ground dwelling, and they like open areas like tundra and alpine habitat. For us, this means that you can reliably see them, for example, on the Barrens at Cape St. Mary's and along sections of the East Coast Trail. So we actually see pipits relatively easily here. They're not particularly shy, but they are really well camouflaged, so they can be surprisingly easy to miss. And because they like these sort of open, barren areas, they deal with relatively harsh weather, and they have a pretty short breeding cycle. It is possible to confuse these guys with sparrows, because we're talking about little brown birds, as Jenna pointed out last year, that hop around on the ground. So things you'll be looking for to separate it from the sparrows is largely the shape of the bill. So remember that the sparrows, you're looking at sort of conical bills, whereas you see this long, thin bill on the pipit. And behaviorally, they bob their tails when they're perched or walking, which you don't usually see in sparrows. So the field marking on these guys, they're grayish brown above. They have a pale eyebrow over the eye. They've got the long, thin bill that I mentioned. They're streaky below, and when they fly, you'll see white edges on the outermost tail feathers. But again, just to make life complicated, the amount of streaking and the color below will vary a lot throughout their range. So it can be difficult to use those as ID cues. And since I started with pictures of nests, I wanted to finish with the picture of a nest as well. So this is one of the other very few nests that I found here in Newfoundland. This was in Gross Mourne up on the top of a mountain, so in that alpine habitat, and that's a pipit nest kind of buried under the moss there. All right, I think we have only a couple species left to go. So this is the Cedar Wax Wing, again, something that many of you may be familiar with. They're beautiful, beautiful birds. And I can say, as somebody who has captured and banded and handled a lot of birds, they are by far the silkiest birds I have ever held. These guys tend to travel in flocks, and they make very high-pitched calls, and they'll sort of descend on a tree that bears berries or a shrub that bears berries, and they'll just eat the entire supply very, very quickly. And because they eat so many berries, they've actually been known to become drunk when they eat fermented fruit. For these guys, they actually breed a little bit later in the year than many other bird species because they're waiting for the fruit to ripen. And the ID cues for this guy, we've got this nice black mask with white edging, brown head and chest, and you see that little crest on the head, a yellowish belly, and then the dark tail with yellow tips, and then these little red tips on the secondaries. And this is actually what they're named for. They look a little bit like drops of sealing wax, and they are actually made of a waxy secretion. We're not entirely sure what they're for, and not all birds have them. So you'll see paler cedar waxwings that don't have these red tips, but it's theorized they may be for mate attraction. That being said, whether or not you've got the red tips, there isn't much you can confuse with a cedar waxwing, except just to make life difficult, there is another waxwing species, the Bohemian waxwing. It's not too much of a problem here in Newfoundland because Bohemian waxwings are here in the winter and cedar waxwings breed here in the summer. So season's going to be your best cue there. But if you're looking for ways to distinguish them, look at the underside of the bird. So with the cedar waxwing, you've got a yellow belly, and then the vents, so the undertail coverts, are white. Whereas with the Bohemian waxwing, you've got this gray belly and then these cinnamon colored undertail coverts. So Bohemian waxwings are also bigger and cedar waxwings are more delicate, but the easiest way is to look underneath them. You can also look at this white wing bar, which appears on the Bohemian waxwing, but not on the cedar waxwing. Okay, and this is our last bird species. So almost made it by 8:30. It's a little bit sad to end with this one because we're finishing with what is many people's least favorite bird, the European Starling. But I didn't want to leave it out because it's one of the most common birds that you will come across, especially in cities. So these guys are invasive, as the name suggests. They are from Europe, and there are about 200 million of them in North America, all of which are descended from 100 individuals that were set loose in Central Park in New York in the 1890s. And this was done by a group of colonists who thought that North America needed all of the birds mentioned in Shakespeare. So their populations obviously took off immensely, and they have caused decline in some of our native species, especially cavity nesting species. So these guys are also cavity nesters, and they've taken over a lot of the relatively limited supply of cavities. Interestingly, though, even though they're doing so well here, European starlings are not doing particularly well where they're native in Europe. So these are chunky birds. They're roughly blackbird sized. And sorry, the non-breeding birds are spotted, whereas the breeding birds, they're sort of dark overall with this purple-green iridescence. I think my voice is telling me it's time to stop talking. The last cue to look at here is this yellow bill, which is dark in the non-breeding season and then becomes yellow in the breeding season. And with that, I'm going to seize the opportunity to stop talking and jump into our quiz. So let me launch the poll here. And we'll see what people have learned tonight if you're able to stick around for the quiz. All right, so reasonable amount of participation here. Any more guesses? All right, so I'm going to end the poll, share the results, and most of you knew that this was indeed a brown creeper. So it's on this tree trunk here propping itself up with the tail. All right. So I'm just going to move on to the next one and not talk too much more. So we've got a brown creeper here. And have a look and tell me what this one is. This one's a little bit tricky. Getting a little bit less participation on this one. People are a bit slower to answer. Any more guesses? Okay. So over 50% of you got it right. It is a Philadelphia Vireo. You can see that sort of lighter eyebrow, and you can see the yellow wash, which is why I put Yellow-Bellied Flycatcher in there. So Yellow-Bellied Flycatcher, I can see why you'd think that based on the yellow wash. Red-eyed Vireo, we would expect to see a bolder face pattern. And ruby crown kinglet, you'd be looking for those wing bars. It's also hard to see, but it does have that classic Vireo bill with the hook at the end. Okay. All right, and this is our classic difficult one. Like I said, I've seen many expert birders get this wrong. And yet, most of you are pretty sure you know what it is. All right, we'll end it there. So overwhelmingly, you said common raven, which is indeed what it is. The giveaway clue is going to be this shaggy throat. And you can also see a longer tail, and even though it's not flying, you can see a bit of that diamond shape there. So good job, you guys are experts. And I thought I was fooling you with the Canada Jay fledgling. Okay, next species. We'll see if we can figure out what this guy is. People are a little less sure of this one. Okay, it looks like the guesses are slowing down here. Any last minute answers? Couple. All right, so you guys were kind of split between ruby crown kinglet and Lee's flycatcher. It is a ruby crown kinglet. Remember I said don't rely on that ruby crown as an ID feature. So this is a ruby crown kinglet. a least flycatcher, I was trying to pick things specifically that did actually have wing bars. But for a least flycatcher, you would expect a much more upright posture. So flycatchers in general, you do expect that upright posture. Golden crown kinglet, right shape, right size, but not the boldly patterned face. So you only see the eye ring here versus the eye line and the crown and the black stripes on the golden crown kinglet. And blue-headed vireo, again, a little bit more of an upright posture often, but also you'd expect those spectacles and a much darker head. Okay, and moving on to this guy. Okay, we've only got 65% of people who've answered. Any more last minute guesses before I close the poll? Okay, we're up to 75%. That'll do. So again, more than 50% of you got this right. It is indeed a hermit thrush, and I hope what you guys were looking at is that contrast between the color of the back and the reddish color of the tail and rump. For a veery, you'd expect less spotting and a darker back. For a Swainson's thrush, you'd expect that buffy spectacle around the eye, and you wouldn't expect the difference between the rump and the back. And for a pipit, among other things, you'd expect streaking along the breast, not spotting. Okay. All right, and we only have 3 more, so this guy and 2 after. I'm glad that so many of you are able to stick around. All right, only 60%. This is a tough one. Oh, okay, we're up to 70% participating. Anybody want to put in their last minute guesses before I end the poll? Anyone? Okay. So again, more than 50% of you, more than 60% of you got this right. This is a yellow-bellied flycatcher. So you've got that nice yellow belly here. You've got the wing bar. You've got the eye ring there. Alder and least flycatcher. Obviously, I did say flycatchers are quite difficult. For an alder flycatcher, you'd expect a grayish band across the chest. And for a least flycatcher, you'd actually expect no yellow on the breast and a smaller bill. And then for a kinglet, again, you'd have that, you'd have a less upright posture and a boldly patterned face.
Catherine, I'm just going to jump in quickly. If you have many more of these poll birds, just can you leave them for a couple more seconds with just the picture before you put up the poll window? We've just got some comments about iPad users. Thanks.
Okay, got it. Will do. Okay. So I'll leave him for a second, have a look at him. All right, and I'll open the poll now. Okay. So we're at almost 80% participation. Put in your guesses if you've got any last minute ones. And I'm going to end the poll and share it. 50% of you, again, got it right. So it is an American pipit. You see the light eyeline there and the long, thin bill, and otherwise a pretty nondescript bird. This one was super tricky. Again, I did that on purpose. Redwing Blackbird female, you would expect a different shape of bill. Swainson's thrush, I can definitely see how it would be easy to mistake for Swainson's thrush, but you don't have the spectacled look, so the eye ring and the lower part being buffy. Instead, you've got that eye line. And you can't see much of the breast, but you've got streaking instead of spotting. Winter wren, you would expect a tail being held upwards, so that classic wren posture, among other things. And then you'd expect barring on the wing and tail. Okay, and one last bird to go. It's a fun one to end on. I'll give people a second to have a look at it. Okay, and launch the last poll. And the answers are just pouring in here. Okay, I'll give people a couple more minutes, or not minutes, seconds. Okay, and we've got high participation on this one, 88% of people. So I'll end the poll. And yes, overwhelmingly, you got it right. This is a tree swallow, white below, iridescent blue above. Beautiful bird. Blue-headed vireo, it does have a blue head, I agree, but it doesn't have the vireo bill. It's got a very tiny bill. And then instead of a white eye ring and white spectacles, you see that black mask. All right, well, I am going to say that's it for today because apparently I need to stop talking and just say that we hope to see many of you again next week. Thank you for coming out tonight.
Thanks, Catherine. We're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat as usual. So that was a lovely presentation. Lots of species that we went through.
Many species today. Yep.
Yes.
I know that was a bit overwhelming, but the recording will be available online.
Yes, the recording will, as always, be available online. And something popped up that somebody said in the chat, which I thought was a good little tip for crows versus ravens, to remember the V-shaped tail for raven, because the V is in the word raven.
That is an excellent tip. Yeah. That is a great tip.
And we didn't really have many other questions tonight. There was one about if blue-headed vireos have another name, and they used to be called a solitary vireo. And then solitary vireo was split into 3 species. The blue-headed vireo is one of those. So
thank you.
There's some people hoping that you get your voice back.
Me too. I guess that was too many species.
Yep.
But it's not COVID, I promise. All right, well, we'll end it there. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you for sticking around for a little extra.